does the term equity mean to students and their families in the state of Delaware? This week on the agenda, we have an upfront conversation with Mr. James Simmons, Director of the Delaware Department of Education's Office of Equity and Innovation, as well as education advocate Ms. Raye Jones Avery. We called them in to learn more about the role social justice plays in school and how COVID-19 and distance learning have exacerbated inequities and the challenges facing at-risk students and educators. Mr. Simmons, how are you?
I'm well, thank you.
Thank you so much for joining the agenda this week.
Absolutely, glad to be here.
So, newly appointed, newly branded Office of Equity and Innovation. Tell us a little bit about that.
So when the reemergence of this, I'm gonna say social justice or maybe social injustice started occurring, I think we all use George Floyd's unfortunate passing as that reemerging kickoff point. The governor met with Dr. Bunning and wanted to rebrand my office from the Office of Innovation and Improvement to the Office of Equity and Innovation.
For folks that don't know, who are not familiar with all the ins and outs of the Department of Education and how things work, what is your office tasked to do?
Overall, initially I'll say, was to improve educational outcomes for students who reside within the city limits. And the innovation piece was to make sure that we're looking at doing things differently than things that have been done in the past, right? We sometimes say the same thing louder and think that it's going to change. So the innovation piece was to let's improve by doing things different. But then when you added the equity piece to it, then it really around educational equity. And I think it's important that and I start most meetings with defining terms, like equity doesn't mean race. So talking about equal treatment or fairness of people who aren't given that fair shake.
Over the past 15, 16 months, a lot of students have been either remote or, lack of a better word, lost. What are we doing to bring these students back online and ensure that they're coming back to an environment that has weathered the injustices of their communities and families?
I think we'd make a mistake if we just reopen schools in the manner in which we left them. I think there's a ton of lessons learned from the pandemic by going, I'm gonna say hybrid or remote or some combination. And we'd be remiss if we didn't take those lessons learned and apply them to how we re-enter. My fear is that because of the timing, we're just gonna re-engage in the way that we've done before. Having said that, to your question, there's a ton of kids who didn't engage. And so we're trying to come up with a strategic plan on how to re-engage them. My office specifically is working with, I'm going to say boots on the ground organizations to try to say, let's try to find a different approach to getting to those kids. Sending an alert now or an email blast to folks who may not check email or may not even have a phone isn't going to re-engage them, but it would check the box for districts to be able to say that they've made a gallant effort to reach them. So we're trying to go out to community centers, churches, youth league football and sports practices to say, here's some students who haven't been engaged, and maybe some have and some haven't, and here's some information to re-engage you. When I was in Brandywine, I oversaw our alternative ed placements, and oftentimes those students worked on a computer. Oftentimes families would say, my son, daughter, XYZ has never been more productive. Why does he or she have to go back to the traditional environment? It doesn't work for everyone, so I think we've got to be cognizant of that.
So are we communicating to folks only in the city, or is this statewide?
Both. So there's a portion or faction of my office that's just focusing on the city of Wilmington, but the equity is things that has to happen statewide. What are the inequities that are occurring in your specific district, and how can we support you, the students, the teachers, and the buildings to make sure that those practices oftentimes are removed?
What is, and I'm assuming that you would know more than anyone, what is the pulse right now of the school or of schools in the state of Delaware in regards to social injustice or tension?
I think the pandemic probably helped that pulse. Okay. It allowed the anger, the frustration to not be in a building, and it allowed the opportunity to be addressed, I'm going to say virtually, in terms of there were a number of forums, with students in student-led forums, and there were a number of groups that did outstanding jobs. I participated as a moderator or a panelist on a number of those. I think student voice has often been overlooked in education. We oftentimes do things to and for kids and not with them. And I think that's the mindset we have to take, that what are we going to do with kids to benefit their education? And I think if that mindset moves into September when we bring kids back, I think we have a chance to improve outcomes.
So when I'm thinking of equity within schools, I'm thinking two things, right? I'm thinking whether or not one student A and student B is both getting the same education, okay? Fairly. Their books and their books match. The other thing is discipline, okay? That is one student A being treated the same way as student B in times of discipline. Is your office working with that?
We got to look at two things. Is it the code or the policies that are in place that cause the disproportionality, or is it the application of such? And oftentimes it's the application. And so I'll use this example. When I was in a district, I often looked at the data, because data can drive and inform your decisions, Absolutely. Right? What are the top 5 discipline issues? You know what number 1 is in almost every school?
I would guess to say attendance, maybe.
No, cell phone issues.
Okay.
Right? But why are kids of color being disproportionately suspended around a cell phone when every kid has a cell phone? You can't find 5 kids that don't have a cell phone, that don't text, that don't call. That. So why is it so disproportionate? Now, it's the application of such, right? So here's an example. Jim Simmons has his cell phone out and the teacher says, Jim, give me your phone. And I go, I'm not giving you my phone. But then when she asks Stephanie, who's blonde with a ponytail, she goes, Stephanie, put your phone away. Right? And so now the application is different. And what I do is go, you didn't take Stephanie's phone, but yet you want to take mine. And now I'm sent to the office for being disobedient or defiant. And it really isn't a cell phone issue. And who caused that problem? Did I cause the problem, or was it the application of the policy that caused the problem?
So the training of the teachers.
Absolutely.
What are we doing as a state? And I'm sure your office is playing a role in that, to educate the teachers to alleviate some of these issues.
So so one of the fallbacks that people hear and don't want to hear is that the state really doesn't have any control over the local districts and charters.
No, we want to hear that.
What we are is we're a support agency, right? So that equity network I talked about earlier is to help those equity leads be able to take this information and go back to their districts and provide training. We're having an equity summit in October 8th, our statewide professional development day, to talk about those inequities and those policies and practices that sometimes are applied, misapplied maybe, that are causing some of those disproportionalities. So as a state, we're trying to be supportive of what the districts are doing, but also saying, let's approach it from the same way. What is your discipline data, or any data, telling you? It could be data around the lack of minorities in AP classes. Why is that, right? And so looking at any disproportionality that you have based on data, and then let's find a resource and a plan to eliminate that disproportionality.
So where do the parents come in this? How are we communicating this to parents to ensure that the same message at home is the same message that's in the classroom, and letting them know what's going on? Because it's obviously a concern. Everyone's watching the news and understanding that there are issues. So what can parents do, or what is happening with parents?
When we talk about it takes a village to raise a child, it takes a village to educate one. And the more we can get the parents, the schools, the administrators, the teachers on board together and engage in those conversations, we have a chance of improving it. So we've got, it's a task. I think we've got to do things differently. We expect, if you look at historically PTA engagement, elementary school it's really high, middle school it falls off. When you get to high school, it's almost null and void in terms of that. So, but why is that? And so we've got to look at doing things different. I think we've got to take PTA meetings to our community. Oftentimes it's a travel or resource issue. So let's go to them. Let's have a parent engagement meeting at a community center versus at a school.
Give me 3 more things that you would like to see happen or begin over the next year.
I think that we've got to address trauma in the state of Delaware. And everyone has it. I think the list of ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, has grown. I think there used to be 10. COVID alone probably added to that list. The violence in the city has added to that list. So I think we've got to address the impact of trauma on students' education.
And how would you guys at the Department of Education go ahead and treat something like that?
We've got to diversify the educator workforce. We know research says that kids learn better when they have people in front of them that look like them, come from similar backgrounds, right? I don't know if you were fortunate or not fortunate enough to ever have an educator of color when you were growing up. Two. So think about that, two in, I'm gonna say K to 12, in 13 years, 2 educators of color. So we've said by that lack of, this isn't important to us.
But how can we fix that?
So I think we've got to actively recruit. I think we've got to change the narrative around education. We as educators have allowed education to be a fallback profession. I'll go do X, Y, and Z, and then I can always come back to education. I think our society has to value educators more. We talk about engineers and lawyers and doctors and how important they are, and we show that by the salaries we make. But then none of them could be who they are without educators who are on the bottom end of that pay scale. So I think we need to look at what that says about the importance of teaching.
So now you have the ear right now on this show of legislators. What would you tell them in regards to this issue? Because I believe it is very important to have more people of color in the educational system. So what would you tell legislators about this?
I would tell them that we need to look at it. I would say, like, how are we going to address bringing people of color into this field? Now, when I say people of color, that doesn't dismiss males, right? I think we need people of color, indigenous folks. I think we need the LGBTQ community represented. I think that we need males in elementary schools. So we've got to look at all those things and how are we trying to do that. I would also add that we've got to promote our state. We've got to promote the state of Delaware, and it can't just be home of tax-free shopping, right? We've got to promote what are the good things that happen in Delaware. I often jokingly say that Delaware is the San Diego of the East Coast, and people laugh. But you can get anywhere and any activity you want from Delaware in less than 2 hours.
That's right.
That's a huge, huge feature when you talk about families, right? And so I think we've got to incorporate all those things. The other thing I think we have to do is engage our institutes of higher learning. Delaware State, Wilmington University, Goldie Beacon, Del Tech. I can't leave out University of Delaware since that's where my degree's from. We've got to engage them in the conversation to say, what are we doing differently to incentivize people coming to universities and want to major in education?
So if you had the president's ear right now in regards to University of Delaware, Wilmington University, all the institutions of higher learning here in the state, what would you tell them? What would be on your wish list from them?
I think some incentives would be the first thing. I think you can do incentives on the front end and the back end, or maybe both. So, for example, we're going to offer X number of scholarships if you come to the University of Delaware and you major in education. Now, that scholarship could just be tuition, you're responsible for room and board. On the back end, you say, if you work in the state of Delaware's high need schools, or maybe even any school, because I think all schools need to diversify the educational workforce, then we're going to pay back your student loan for 5 years. So those things are money in your pocket without even creating the raise that we talked about around salary, right? If somebody removed, I say my mortgage, all of a sudden I have a lot more money, right? So I think we've got to create incentives for folks, and then on top of the salary increases. You could argue incentivize the housing market to say we're going to create neighborhoods around education and have teachers living in the community in which they teach. I know I live in Brandywine School District. I taught there or worked there for 24 years in different capacities, and I've lived there maybe the last 15 years. It made a huge difference when I was a principal in the building, because families saw me in the supermarket and they could get to me. It wasn't a meeting. It didn't have to go through my administrative assistant. That bridges a lot of gaps when people feel like they can walk up and say, I saw Mr. Simmons and he talked to me about X. So I think that those are some creative ideas that we have to look at. And I'm sure there's a ton of others, right? I don't profess to know it all. I just profess to be willing to try something different, because doing the same thing and expecting a different outcome is the definition of insanity, right?
So going back to a point that you made before, the districts in the state are coming up with equity liaisons for each district or building or what have you. What's the progress of that, and can parents be able to reach out to them at the beginning of the school year?
I don't have the list in front of me, but I know, for example, Milford School District just hired a new one. Brandywine hired a new one this year. Cesar Rodney did. I think Cape already had one. Newark Charter has created a position or maybe a responsibility. Some people are creating committees. Polytech has an equity committee. So I think that list is ongoing. Monique Martin, who oversees that work out of my office, is tracking all that and meeting with them and then scheduling. We're calling it the Equity Network, where year one, you're doing this professional development. Year two, you're doing this professional development, and then developing year three as we move forward. So
as an active parent, I have a checklist every year of what I need to do for my kids, okay? And the conversations I need to have with the administrators. What are some conversations that a parent should have with these liaisons in the school district?
I think they've got to have conversations on what's the data saying are the inequities or the equity issues that are occurring in our building. I think families need to know that as opposed to assuming it. Again, I use the example, is it a discipline disproportionality or is it an access disproportionality? We talk about an achievement gap. I don't know that there is an achievement gap, but that achievement gap was created because of an opportunity gap. We haven't provided enough opportunities and maybe at the right time for folks. And so I think we've got to do a better job. So I think parents need to say, what are the issues in this building, and or what are we doing to address them? But thirdly, what can I do to help address them?
What are we doing to mark the pulse of the school district so things just don't happen and we're not prepared as a state organization, or you're not prepared as a state organization to deal with responses as they occur?
That's a great question. I think that's a plan that's constantly being developed. I think that it's the engaging in the conversation initially. I think that schools oftentimes are reactionary to things, i.e. something happens, we've got to respond. I think we've got to charge them to be proactive and put equity on the front end of every decision they make. Okay. When I talked about diversifying the educator workforce, are we looking at not only how many did they hire, how many did they even interview? What did they do in terms of trying to recruit those folks to even apply?
What's the accountability to that? So you provide them the data, they give you all of this, or you give them all of that. Does it just go into the ether, or is there a response to the data in which you provided?
I think we're still developing that. I think the department doesn't want to be, nor should it be, maybe a compliance department.
Somebody has to be the watchdog.
Somebody does have to be the watchdog. I think we've got to create a system that allows people to be a watchdog. And what I mean by that is this. I don't believe in just being a support agency, and I don't mean that to say I don't support Dr. Bunny. What I mean by that is we can be a support agency with non-negotiables, and I think we've got to provide more non-negotiables. I'll use an example of when the governor decided that we're going to open schools remotely or in hybrid. I would argue that we could have put some non-negotiables in to say that everyone will open after this date and everyone will be open by this date. How you get there, that's where you have the ability to say you're going to make those independent decisions. But we've got to put non-negotiables in place, and that helps us to monitor something, and then we can grow from there.
So when it comes to education reform, there are a few top priorities. Educators are looking to cool the atmosphere and equip students to re-enter schools in a time of social injustice, as well as re-engage students who have become academically detached due to the pandemic. More and more, we're seeing students use their voices to address the issues that directly affect them the most. Before we continue, I'd like to introduce you to our new segment, the Washington Minute. We've got Delaware's own U.S. Senator Chris Coons, who's been working very hard on Biden's bipartisan infrastructure package. On this week's agenda, Washington Minute, we have Senator Chris Coons, and he's here to talk to us a little bit more about infrastructure and everything that's going on. Senator Coons, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Kerwin. Great to be on with you.
Thank you. So tell us a little bit more about infrastructure and how it relates to Delawareans.
Well, first, infrastructure is kind of a fancy word. What it really means is roads and bridges, tunnels, airports, broadband. So if we actually pass this big bipartisan package of infrastructure funding that I'm supporting and working on, that would mean both high-paying, high-skilled jobs for folks who would be improving our highways and bridges, our rail, and our infrastructure like broadband, and it would mean better quality services for Delawareans. So if you have trouble being on your cell phone and the signal drops as you're driving around the county or our state, or if there's places where we have kids who just don't have access to Wi-Fi to do homework, or where we can't take advantage of telemedicine, building out broadband infrastructure means those services get better. If you commute on SEPTA into Philadelphia, or if you take Amtrak, like I do, back and forth from Wilmington to Washington, investing in upgrading the rail lines in our region would mean you'd have faster, easier, more affordable travel.
So is it true that you helped develop the framework for this big bill?
I'm one of the group of 24 senators supporting it. My senior senator, Tom Carper, is the chairman of the Public Works Committee that actually is most important in this work, and I'm supporting a lot of good work by other senators.
Senator Coons, thank you very much for your time. We look forward to seeing you on the agenda. Coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic, more questions arise. How do we connect school administrators and the communities they actually serve? What structural changes are needed to make that happen? Joining us now, we've got Raye Avery, former head of the Christiana Cultural Arts Center and longtime Wilmington educational advocate. What are your terms of equity and dealing with the state students here?
Equity is a very complex notion, and it is a word that means different things to different people, but it does have a definition, and the definition for equity is an outcome. And so an outcome is something that can be measured. So when we drive towards equity, our goal is to make absolutely certain that the investment of resources, time, talent, and most importantly, loving care goes to students that are the most vulnerable, students that can do better. We know that they can do better, but they don't have all of the supports that they need to do better. Our students, Black and brown students, and students that don't come from high income levels, not that students that come from high income families don't have needs, so I'm not dismissing that, but the students that live in Black and brown communities' needs have gone unmet for decades. And so driving towards equity is not going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen with the infusion of federal stimulus dollars. It will happen first and foremost when people are collectively driving towards equity. When we are agreeing, how are we measuring the success? How are we measuring how we're getting there? Are we making change? Are students' needs being met differently? Are we seeing some success? And when I say success, I'm not talking just about academic success, because we need to be whole as human beings first before you start to see academic success.
You said something very interesting, that it's not all about the funding.
No, it's
about
not.
The action.
It's about the mindset. It's about the intentionality. It's a moral and a spiritual challenge and dilemma that we have before us, that we have always had as Black people in this country. That's the perspective that I'm coming from. I'm not representing any organization. I'm representing my own viewpoint, and I'm representing the 40 years of experience that I have had in public education as an advocate.
So where are we as a state missing it for our students, in your opinion?
Well, as I tried to say earlier, I'm hopeful.
Okay.
I'm hopeful that we are starting to take the blinders off, and I'm hopeful that we are dispensing with excuse making. Oh, these children are not having success because of the conditions that they live in, or the environmental conditions in their families or in their neighborhood, or this or that. Let's strip away the excuses and let's do what's best for children. And so we are starting to have those conversations. Those conversations were starting pre-COVID, beginning, several years pre-COVID. They have escalated because of COVID, but COVID just pulled the covers off.
And expose what was really
Absolutely,
going on.
what was already going on, and COVID exacerbated it, worsened it, but COVID didn't create it. Because of COVID, people did not realize how much support schools provide every day to children all across this state. Safety, food, socialization, loving, caring, sustained relationships. And the absence of that, school districts, our superintendents, our teachers, everybody rallied around and said, how can we support our students even with these schools being shut down? How can we support our students as we reopen? How can we find the students that we don't even know where they are?
The lost students. So when it comes to what you were stating before, how do we deal with, as citizens of the state of Delaware, accountability that this is taking place? Department of Education can only do so much, so then it comes down to a district level. What can we do as parents?
You just need to know this, that you have a right to be involved in your child's education, that you have a responsibility to do what you can do in your home to make certain that your child is rested, prepared, supported to go to school and to be the very best that they can be. Many parents did not have the tools to help with online learning. And this whole notion that parents are at home helping their kids, 70% of the essential frontline workers that had to go to work, no matter what everybody else was doing during COVID, they were women, and they were predominantly women of color. And so everybody wasn't afforded the luxury of staying at home. I encourage parents to seek out one another and form authentic helping support systems and to be involved with the school.
Now, how can we ensure that we're bringing them back into an equitable environment and working with those families?
Really, really challenging work, but not impossible. Again, everything proceeds from mindset. So those students that have not been logging on for virtual learning, or they log on and then they check out, or you got to go find them. We have housing insecurity. We don't just have food insecurity. We have people living in different houses and moving around. Districts need teams of people that go out and find and recapture the students, and sincerely, in a heartfelt way, that is demonstrated not through words but through action. We want you to come to school. We care about you, and it's boots on the ground kind of work. It's not, we're gonna send you a link. That doesn't work. We've got to go from talk to action. In order to be a change agent, you can't have people remain comfortable. Change does not happen within the context of comfortability.
Okay.
People need to become uncomfortable to change, and the office is not well resourced.
Okay.
Yeah, and so that's a message to the governor.
That more funds and more staffing needs to be placed into that office.
People power, yes.
People power.
People power, and the bones are there. The bones are there. But there are also limitations because they don't have really much authority over the districts and the school boards. And so we've got to understand the decision-making authority and be more engaged with school boards. Like my godmother says, B.B. Ross Coker, you went to the march, but did you go to the school board meeting last week?
Right.
Right?
So that comes down to the accountability factor that I think most citizens want in regards to education.
It comes down, for me, it's about responsibility.
Okay.
So accountability means that I'm responsible for doing something, and you're going to monitor me, and you're going to insist that I deliver. That's accountability. You're going to measure my performance. Responsibility is that I assume the responsibility. I know what I'm responsible for, and I have the integrity and to deliver without you holding me accountable. So accountability is important, but it's external. We need people to accept responsibility for delivering the results. Every school district is different. Every school board is different. And so we're starting to come together in ways that we have not over the last 30 or 40 years. You know, we don't get everything we fight for, but we have to fight for everything we get.
In order to re-engage students as well as achieve equity in schools, we must take a holistic approach. Schools are not just a place of learning, but of development for students of all ages. Thank you for tuning into this week's episode of The Agenda.